My name is Molefi Kete Asante. I'm professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies. Actually, we are now the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. I am also the founding editor of the Journal of Black Studies. My field of interest over the last 30 years has been Afrocentric education, Afrocentric concepts, ideas, and philosophy. Let me start by telling you why this is important and also the origin of this idea. African people were brought to the Americas, and in the United States, African people were here from 1619, actually before it was the United States of America. We were here from 1619 as indentured servants and then as enslaved people until 1865. We were enslaved, consequently, 246 years. We have only been free, technically, for 151 years. So we were enslaved almost 100 years longer than we have been free. But during the period of our enslavement, African people were dislocated psychologically, dislocated economically, dislocated culturally, dislocated linguistically. We were, in effect, moved completely off of our own terms. And by being moved off of our own terms, we were decentered. The narratives of our lives were not our narratives. They were the narratives of Europeans. They were the narratives of white people. We participated in those narratives because our own narratives have been basically destroyed, decentered, dislocated, confused. And so consequently, the effect of this is confusion for the African population. Not only confusion for the African population, but after 1865, there were no people who came together and said, okay, perhaps black people, the 4 million Africans who are freed, maybe there should be some process by which we look at what has happened, a debriefing of the 246 years, some possible way of examining what has happened to African people in terms of culture, in terms of history, in terms of psychology, in terms of spirituality. What's been the result of 246 years of this dislocation? So since we were not debriefed, and since we didn't have any one to process this for us, what happened was a degree of insanity. And in my judgment, this degree of insanity was best seen in the educational system, because the educational system was not designed for African people. The educational system in America was designed for white people. And it was designed essentially to create a situation where those who bought into it bought into a European system of education. That is why African people, I think, have a sense of loss of consciousness or a lack of consciousness. That is why sometimes you see confusion where African people have no understanding of their own history. That is why we see ourselves often on the margins of European history and culture, not in the center of our own story. That is why we ask questions that have nothing to do with the reality of our historical ancestral lineage. For example, if you ask an African person to start with anything in terms of knowledge and history and culture, they normally will give you the European answer, that the Greeks started everything. When we know that the Greeks were very young in human history. If you start with 800 BC, the period of Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad, then you are forgetting that 2,000 years before Homer, African people built the pyramids. Then you are starting with a limited understanding of human history. If you forget geometry, if you forget philosophy, if you forget architecture, if you forget theology, if you forget politics, all of these fields that were started in Africa along the Nile Valley, with the Nile Valley civilizations, long before they were ever in Greece. How do you account for people being sane? You can't be sane if you believe that, because in effect what you're doing is believing something that is false. And if you follow that false track, then what happens is that you're miseducated. That is why Carter G. Woodson in 1933 wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro, because he understood precisely what we understand as Afrocentric educators. And I've educated, I've worked with school districts, many school districts all across the country. And I still work with school districts in trying to teach teachers how to teach African American children. And you teach African American children like you teach any children normally, and that is you start from where they are. You start with their own history, their own culture. If you go to Japan and you start talking about mathematics in Japan, you start with Japanese students and their history and mathematics. If you start talking with them about history, you start with them with their own history. But with African Americans, we are the only people, I think, where the educational experience doesn't begin with us. Our educational experience, whatever it is. If we talk about literature, it normally doesn't start with the African literary experience. So we've got to come back to that. And that's why it's important to have Afrocentric education, because we change the narrative. We change the story. We make the African person the center of his or her own story. If we don't do that, we continue to teach what I believe to be a history, a understanding of information and knowledge, and that really puts African people on the outside of their own story. And that is, to me, a very destructive force in American society. And that's why I've always called for a recentering of information. If you talk to me about the Constitutional Convention, I want to know, what did the black people think who were serving in the kitchen when Thomas Jefferson was in that room? What did they say about Mr. Jefferson? What did they overhear? If I want to know the black people who built the White House and the U.S. Capitol building with their labor, I want to know what conversations you imagine they had when they were doing this. I mean, there are other stories. I want to know the story of York when you tell me about Lewis and Clark. I want to know what did York say? What was he thinking? And we have some of this information in the diaries that have been written. And it's extremely important that we never forget that Afrocentric education is fundamental for us to have a true multicultural education. If we don't have Afrocentric education, then all we do is to repeat white education.